Okay, well, look, thank you very much for attending our webinar. I really have been putting a bit of information to people for quite a while, and I thought it's really so important that I can only pass on what facts and data are telling us and what we're seeing based on views like the ABS and their hard numbers rather than just the way people may feel or feely touchy or whatever you feel about it. So I'm going to run off a set of slides and hopefully that will give you a good idea of our views. Just having to move a couple of things out of the road. Okay, so I want to start by asking the question. Let's get myself moving right. I guess the introduction is, are you feeling there may be slightly less interest in enrolments at your school? Some of you may not. Some might be saying, no, totally the opposite. Got them coming out of our ears. Well, that could be, but it's probably about the area you're in. How do you feel the pool of potential students is for your area? Is it growing or shrinking? And I like people to sort of think about, well, what would be the long-term effect if, from a strategic planning point of view, if it wasn't automatic growth that you may have enjoyed, but it could be that the reality of today's markets is that we're not growing like we used to be. Now, just going to say a couple of comments before I take on the slides. We all hear big picture, Australia's getting older. We all hear that, the average age is going to be this in years and we're all going to be in nursing homes and things of that nature. And I guess the point of that is the only way that happens is there are less younger people or the ratios are changing because people are living longer. I guess a bit of people are living longer, but one of the things I'm really wanting to push on is, in our view, it's also, in a lot of cases, less children coming through. So I like to think of this as a pendulum. And the pendulum is, I'm going to talk my real target, I guess, is independent schools, and I'll call it Catholic secondary schools. Those Catholic schools that are competing and are in that same market for those students. So over the last few years, my view is that pendulum has swung quite much in the favour of the independent and secondary Catholic schools. So the market shares and things has been higher for those. Economics, then that appetite of people to spend a considerable amount of money on their education, on affordability, whether it's grandparents, whether it's parents, it's just that willingness to want to spend and in where they're prepared to spend it. Are they prepared to spend it on independent and secondary Catholic schools, or are they more interested in spending it on a local high school? So the first thing I want to touch on is what's called in 2004, Peter Costello realised a fertility rate was at 1.5. So in a simplistic way of looking at it, it's saying the average lady is going to have 1.5 babies. Now, I'm not interested in ages and things, but let's just say that was what is being measured. Now, on the little graph on the right-hand side, you can see the actual fertility rate dropping. And even though that's been dropping, we still are having more births in Australia, or we had been. And you only have to think that this graph goes right back to 1920. But in 1960, Australia had 10 million people, 1970, 12.5, and 2020, it's 25.6. So, of course, we had to grow at a certain amount, just because there's more people. But what we're seeing is per female, it is dropping and is dropping quite considerably. So the baby bonus ran till 2008, and it actually lifted our fertility rate to 2.08, which is the point here. To 2.02 in 2008. And ever since then, it's been dropping. And it's reached back to 1.5 or 1.50 approximately across Australia by about 2023. So the average lady's having 1.5 babies. So the net effect of that has got to be, how do we create more children? And some of it will come in, you'll see, with immigration. The other point of that is that 2008, child born in 2008 is now a 17 come 18-year-old student, and this is your year 11, year 12 student at this point. We then back that up with migration, and as I explained, we go through the ScoMo years. We then went into a negative area for COVID, and we then have really shot out of the gun. But the long-term plan for migration is, in what they call the intergenerational report, is 235,000 new people coming into our country per year. So obviously when young migrants come in, they bring in young children, and in a lot of cases, they then have children. So that's just how we're trying to keep our population growing. But nobody really knows what the population's going to do. And even the ABS in this population projection from 2022, after the last census, to 71, they said, well, look, here's our high position, here's our low position, here's the medium. We'll probably run on the medium. So they're expecting to get to about 39 million at in around 2071. Meanwhile, they also had the bottom number that said if we stopped all migration and cut ourselves off, we'd actually be going down quite considerably. So let's assume that they know what they're doing, and the middle run is the one they want to get to. Sorry, I'm seeing something. Okay, so just a couple of simple quotes. 2022, 26 million, projected between 34 and 45 by 2071. Annual growth rate of 1.4 is expected to decline, and the average age is going to go from 38 years to somewhere between 43 and 47. So we're living longer and there are less younger people. So I now want to just jump onto what are called the areas that we get data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So they start off at Standard Area 1, 61,000 across Australia. Standard Area 2, Standard Area 3, Standard Area 4, which is 107 across Australia. And just for a perspective, there's about 3,000 postcodes across Australia. So SA2s, which they give us a lot of the data, is not dissimilar to postcodes. So when we look at Australia, and I'm just going to start off in the big picture with the SA4s, we can see that there are SA4s tight in around Melbourne, probably about 8 of them, concentrate around Sydney, and then you get out to the various regional areas. And the colours of these are showing the darker green is what's forecast to be the highest growth of what we've used is 0 to 18-year-olds, because we're all about school-age children. So what we see very quickly is there's not much growth in school. It's going backwards in a lot of these areas, probably still backwards here. And the only growth is really capital cities and some regional areas, probably the north of Sydney especially. Now, I want to take us into having a look, and I apologise to people that aren't Melbourne or Sydney. I am going to concentrate a bit on Melbourne and Sydney because it's the concepts of where I'm trying to take this rather than worry about every city. But we will see each of the main capitals briefly. But let me deal firstly with Melbourne as my example of what I'm wanting to say. So Melbourne breaks up into these statistical area 4s, down around Geelong, out in the west, north, west, north, and down into the Mornington Peninsula. So the growth rate that's showing at the moment, where dark green is our highest growth, probably the next green is almost saying zero growth. Then the next color there, which is that one, inner east, is a bit negative, is definitely negative. The next two are negative more, and finally the Mornington Peninsula is the lowest growth area forecast at the moment for school-age children. And when we actually look at this, we can see what is the total population increase, and this is from 2026 to 2032. Now, when the ABS put their population projections out in October 2024, they only ran it out to 2032 this time. Previously, when they'd done it in 2019, they actually ran it out to 2032 as well. But I imagine they found that going out that last 10, 15 years is a little bit iffy, and areas they get themselves into trouble. So this time they only went out to 2032, and we have taken a decision of just extrapolating from 2030 to 2032 in a straight line to give some sort of prediction that we use internally or with schools out to 2037. But let's just use the hard numbers from the ABS. So what they're expecting in Melbourne was growth of about 535,000 people. And we can see where it's expected to grow. The big ones are obviously the Metro Southeast and Outer West. So this is your Clyde North down that area and out into the Werribee area. I'll just go back. So here's your big growth there and your big growth here coming. Okay, but on the other hand, we've then got how many 5 to 18-year-olds are expected. And what we actually see is like inner Melbourne, which was around the Richmond and CBD area, actually a drop of 27 children. Well, that's zero, let's call it. Then we see inner east actually dropping, forecast to drop 3,460 school-age children, or 5.2% over the 6-year period. We then show growth, big growth in these ones, especially this, what's called the Werribee Wyndham area, 12.5%. And then I guess the one that's going backwards most here in Melbourne is the Mornington Peninsula, 8.8, negative. Now, I know I have some schools on today that are on that area, and you only have to sort of think about what's happening down around Sorrento and down the bottom of the Mornington Peninsula, where a lot of people have moved from having their holiday house to now being where they live. And obviously the cost of houses is totally unattractive to young people moving in there. So we actually see the biggest growth coming out of that SA4. Just to give you a comparison for regional, you can see, and what happened in Melbourne, quite a lot of people moved out to the Bendigos and Ballarats and the inner regions, not too far out of Melbourne, when they found they didn't have to work every day in an office and things of that nature. So your Latrobe Valleys, your Geelongs, Bendigo, Ballarat kicked in the biggest, whereas you're out in the northwest, which is up towards Mildura, and the Warrnambool in the southeast, so they're southwest, they're now quite a bit away from Melbourne. They still actually are forecast to drop in school-age children. And when we can really see this, when we actually look at the fertility rates that are published now for these areas, we can see now inner Melbourne is actually showing at 0.79, but that is still forecast to stay stable. So other people are probably moving in with their kids and it's keeping it right. But the actual production of children is absolutely very low. Inner East, Melbourne, and this is the one I'm going to concentrate on a fair bit because this is your Kew, Hawthorn, Camberwell, Box Hill, this inner east of Melbourne, which is very similar to your eastern suburbs of Sydney, your Perth areas of down around Cottesloe, Claremont. You sort of understand that these are the areas that the higher socio-demographic. Then you can see that even in the West is still only growing at 1.75 based on pure number of kids born in the area, But what you're finding is a lot of people are then moving into the area with their young kids because that's where the actual population, where the new houses are being built. And your Marsden Parks in Sydney and your Leppingtons and things like this are the similar type of thing. And actually, people seem to be even more productive out in the country. But let's just say the country, don't ask me why, I'm not going to go down there, but you're getting up near 2 in the northwest and some of these country areas. But again, the country's still fairly strongly producing children, but still not reaching, very rarely reaching that 2.0 number. If we move to Sydney, we're actually seeing medium problem in what's called the the northern beaches, quite a problem, and that is really starting at Manly here uh, and right up to Pittwater. It is not, and again, you think of it, high socio-economic, very expensive to buy in there. It's just grandma and grandpa won't move out early enough, and younger families just can't afford to move in anyway, unless they happen to have inherited the castle. You can see other areas here are pretty neutral. Still not bad in your eastern suburbs, and it's probably because that part of it's probably stronger, whereas up here would be again very low. But then your big growth in Sydney's your Marsden Parks out towards the airport, and it's going to keep growing ballistically out in these areas over the next few years. Sydney, just by comparison, when I look at the 5 to 18-year-olds, you can see your inner eastern suburbs still dropping fractionally, 182. But then you get down to your northern beaches, it's actually forecast to drop 7% or 3,409 children over the next 6 or 8 years. So you can see where the really the problems are going to be. Again, fertility rates, similar story. Centre of Sydney, yes, not much at all. All of these inner suburbs are very low. And then when we get out into some of these regional areas and the outer suburbs, it kicks in. Just to give Brisbane a quick thing, I don't want to feel that you're left out. The main growth's going to be in around central Brisbane, and then things are happening down on the Gold Coast, especially at Pimpalmas, and still forecast to grow out in these outer areas, but probably not from such a big base. Adelaide, again, follow the water, stick to the beaches, and the Gawler and up there, but it's not as much growth through what's been your Elizabeth and these areas as it used to be. Quite negative here and very negative once you sort of get south of Adelaide. And the last one's Perth, the Catamunda area, not much these days, but Perth's probably issue is for the schools that we deal with is what's happening around here. And this is the Cottesloe, Claremont and up to City Beach sort of area, which is the highest socio-economic of Perth. Perth's other big growth is going on down here, and it keeps growing up to the very north. Now, I do want to keep concentrating, and I'm sorry, I apologise to others, but let me use the Melbourne example because what we learn in Melbourne is very similar to elsewhere. Firstly, by the purple dots are the independent schools in Melbourne. And guess what we see? They are very concentrated around here. Inner Melbourne, so I'm down at my Brighton Grammar, Brighton area down here, right up through the Q schools, and then it sort of drops off a bit. But I want to concentrate specifically on this area because it's the issue I'm seeing that I believe is going to cause the problem. And when I'm now going to just talk about what's called the SA3 of Boroondara, which includes Camberwell, Kew, Hawthorn. So even if you're not from Melbourne, I'm sure you've heard of it. I am a Hawthorn supporter for what it's worth, and most of us know where Hawthorn is. So this gives us an idea of how many sort of schools are in this area. Very high concentration. And I just wanted to run a couple of numbers on it because I guess it shows the picture. So in 2021, there were 28,000 school children aged between 6 and 18. Why I'm using that number is because that represents 13 years of schooling. So whether you started at prep and finished at year 12 or whatever, I've covered that area of schooling of 13 years. Now, at the census, there was 27,000 kids at school, primary and secondary, because the census asked you, where do you live? What school do you go to? What type of school do you go to? Primary or secondary, Catholic, government, and independent. Now, out of that, I was able to go and look at every one of these schools in 2021, and there was 9,284 children going to independent schools and 2,631 going to what I'll call Catholic secondary schools. So that gave me a number of 11,900 of children at the school. And we know there was, sorry, I'll rephrase that. There was 11,900 kids living in the area that went to either independent primary, secondary, or Catholic. Now, when I went and added up the ACARA numbers for those schools, they actually have 16,756 children at the schools, a combination of all those schools in 2021. And I'm not counting government schools and I'm not counting primary Catholic schools. The net effect of that is it means that 4,841 children must not be living in Burundara and coming into Burundara. Now, even more than that, there will be kids living in Burundara that go to school outside and others that live outside and come in. But the net effect of, forget the ones that just balance, there's still another 4,800 coming into Burundara to go to those schools. So when I actually look at Burundara as the statistical area 3 for Burundara, I actually can see the forecast numbers from the ABS is that by 2026, there's 30,674 children living in Burundara. By 2032, that's expected to be 27,858. So it's going to drop about 2,500 on just the pure number of kids living in Burundara over that next 6-year period. Now, I'm sure those schools aren't planning to just automatically walk away and say, oh, we're going to drop off 5% of our students, not voluntarily anyway. So the point is, how do you get more students if you're in that situation? And I guess the only answer to that is you either try and convert more that would otherwise be going to government school to come to you, or you bring more in from outside. Now, it's all easy to say, let's bring them in from Eltham and let's bring them in from Ringwood and let's win more kids from out there. But I guess the schools that are out there, they have a different view on life. Their view is that, no, we're going to do our best to compete, and probably on price, and just there's a simple thing of saying it is easier to go to school somewhere near where you live than be traipsing halfway across Melbourne to go to school. So I'll touch on that one in a minute. But the point is, Burundara is typical of these areas where high socio-economic, lots of very strong independent schools and secondary Catholic, and they're actually forecast to drop in the number of children over the next 6 years. The contrast to that, obviously, is somewhere like Wyndham or Werribee, which is actually forecast to grow, it's unbelievable, from in 2026 about 82,000 children now to by 2032 it'll be 97,000. And when we extrapolate that out to 2037, we get about 108,000 students. So from 2026, 82 to 108 has got to be another 26,000 children, school-age children living in the Wyndham area. The very obvious to that is, well, these schools aren't going to suddenly pick up and move themselves to there, and nor are the people living in the Wyndham area probably quite happy enough to pay the fees in general that are being charged by the schools over in Burundara. But the point of the whole exercise is government and other schools, or low-fee independent schools, are having a field day in these areas, where it's probably getting tighter for a lot of schools over in these areas, and time is not in favour. It's going to hurt over in these high socio-economic areas. Now, just doing a little similar exercise on Sydney, I went to called the SA3 of Pittwater, and that's expected to drop from 11,679 in 2026 down to 10,571 by 2032. So it's going to drop about 1,500 or nearly 2,000 children, 1,500 children in that next 6-year period. Now, the SA4 I was referring to earlier was the one that includes both Pittwater and I'll call it, down around Narrabeen and those areas, Manly. So again, these areas, and that one's probably very concerning because it's very hard to get more children to come. Fish don't go to school. And as much as you might say, well, in a lot of cases we can bring kids in from other areas, you pretty quickly see that they are limited by Pittwater on the north, the beaches right down across the east, and then obviously high schools in the same sort of batch to their south. So you start becoming very isolated, and that becomes a real issue. But on the other hand, go out to Blacktown, which is Marsden Park, and you're going to go from, similar to our Werribees, 42,000 in 2026 to about 51,000 in just under 52,000 in 2032, or up nearly 10,000 students just in this Marsden Park area here. Okay, I want to take it over a quick bit on socio-economics. Now, many of you have heard me talk about SEIFA, Socio-Economic Index for Areas, and this is the government's way of doing some measurement on how socio-economic, how high you are. So the top 10% is out here. Here's our Toorak's, and here's our Cottesloes and Claremonts, and here's our Bellevue Hills and eastern suburbs. And then probably most major capital cities don't get under around here. And when you get out to regional areas, especially the outback, you start hitting down into these very lower areas. So the areas I was talking about with my eastern suburbs and Burundara are typically here, and it works its way down. I've just put a map in here to show Melbourne, and what we've done here is the dark blue is the top 20% socio-economically, then the light blue, then the white, then the light brown, and then the brown. And it again comes very evident of how the concentration of independent schools are very much in the concentration of high socio-demographic areas. And, you know, there aren't too many of them coming down here into Werribee at this point in time. And I have had a bit to do with some of the ones up here in the Hume area, and they are, look, absolutely going gangbusters. And, you know, there is a lot of people quite happy to pay a $6,000 or $7,000 a year for education compared to the government school options, but they're probably not that keen on 35,000 down in the other areas. So when we look at these, as I bring this in a bit closer, you really can see this high concentration in these inner suburbs that I touched on in Melbourne. Here's that Burundara area. Sorry, I jumped too quick. Here's that Burundara area, and we can really see the high density of the schools. If I look at Sydney, similar things. We're getting this high group right throughout to sort of where the, I'll say out to Strathfield, that area, still very strong through here, and then it drops off considerably. Sydney is a bit unusual in that it goes from high socio-economic down to sort of lowest, then it actually starts to kick up a bit once you get out some of the other side. Again, northern suburbs, very strong up through here, big concentration of schools up in this area, of very big schools, Knox Grammar included, and you can see how the growth is not going to be coming that much in these areas. It's coming in these outer suburbs. Just thought I'd show the same for Brisbane. Again, high concentration of schools in this inner area, and they're the higher socio-economic areas. You get down into the Logans and things, it's pretty low. And as you can see where the issues are going to lie. Now, I just want to talk about a lot of schools I've got on this webinar are very much higher socio-economic. So we did a little bit of research ourselves. And what we did was we took a big group of schools of campuses we had, totally anonymously, and we just plonked the school in the same point. Imagine every school could be moved onto the same point and then actually angled around so that we could address where they sat compared to the CBD of Melbourne. So we call them annular rings. There's a 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc. going out. And these schools are a group mainly across this whole high socio-economic area. So we had 13,000 students across 16 campuses in the inner high socio area of Melbourne. And then we did a second exercise, which also involved about 13,000 students out of what we'd call sort of the middle and outer economic area. So I'm outside of Maburandaras, but I'm out into the ringwards and down around towards the beaches and all of those sort of areas that are more, I'll call them middle to outer. Now, the really interesting exercise here was, even though we had 13,000, we imagined just turning that into a school of 1,000. So divide by 13. What we found was in the first 0 to 1 kilometre, we would have 9.3% of our students. The next 1 to 2 kilometres, about 23%, 37, as it's progressively. And by the time we got out to our 4 kilometre ring, we'd actually got 50% of the students were already inside that 4 kilometre ring. By the time we got to 8 kilometre, we had 82% of our students covered, but we still had about 12% outside the 10K ring. Why I bring this ring thing up is if I said I had my 9.3% with 93 students, and you all remember the good old pi r squared, what we'd be seeing is we'd have 3.14 square kilometres, 93 students, and we'd have 29.7 students per square kilometre. Our second ring out, we've now gone out past that first kilometre and out the second. So it's a lot bigger ring. It would actually be 6.28 square kilometres by the time we went around the circle. And it would end up at about 23 students per square kilometre. Now, I'm not going to keep following my logic, but then 14.3, 10.3. By the time we're out at about 7 to 8 kilometres from our school, we're probably getting about 1.7 students per square kilometre. And why that's, I think, is very interesting is I'm not into doing the social media like a lot of the schools are, but you may be paying to Facebook or somebody to be able to address the households within a certain area. Now, if that area is right near your school, you're already getting a good bang for your buck, and that is probably the best students you want, are the students near where you are. Going and spending a whole lot of money on a couple of suburbs that might be 9 to 10 kilometres out, the averages show they would have about 0.8 students per square kilometre. Now, I'm going to just touch on an old boss of mine when I worked for Caldex said averages can be dangerous. He said you can stand with your feet in a bucket of iced water, stick your head in an oven, your average temperature might be 39 degrees, but you're bloody dead. So the rule of averages can be a bit dangerous, but the point is this is sort of indicative of what you see of an inner type of school. So spending a lot of money, unless there's a great reason that this suburb 9 to 10 kilometres from the school is going to be incredibly huge in the next few years, is probably not brilliant. But on the other hand, I can talk about areas like what's going to happen when the Rosehill Racecourse closes in Sydney and how that is probably really attractive for quite a lot of schools that are on the rail lines, etc., and can really benefit from it. So I'm just saying be wise, but don't automatically think that these areas are going to be fantastic. We did the same for this outer Melbourne group, and what we found was at about half the children lived literally at about the 5.5 kilometre from the school. and still 23% lived from further than 5 kilometres from the school. So again, you can follow the arithmetic, but it obviously dropped off significantly more than the group that were in from the schools in the inner metro area. So I guess I call it the volcano theory. Highest concentration of students come from close to your school. You'd expect about 30 from first 1 square kilometre, or that first circle per square kilometre, and about 1.7 at about 8. So think about that when you're doing your digital marketing, because marketing a long way away is not necessarily a great idea. And I just put on this just to give an idea in that sort of group of schools. We were doing a summit for Educate Plus at Carey, so I used them as the centre point. And that's a 4 kilometre ring, and this is the 8 kilometre ring, just to give you a relativity of Melbourne. Now, I'm just going to touch this. I started off by saying in my early comments that the pendulum, in my view, is swinging. And I just want to touch on some bigger numbers, the CARA numbers. I'm going to briefly run through them. Everybody who's on today will be sent a copy of this presentation and the slides, so you might follow it a bit more in detail. In 2008, there were 644,000 at Catholic schools, and that became 768 by 2024. Notice the changes that happened from 2020 to 2024 for all these groups. Government was 2.252, now 2.632, and it actually went backwards across this part of the period, went negative. Independent schools, of which most of you are probably 519,647 at COVID and 744 by the 2024. So what we're seeing in market share, which I've got here, is the independent schools went from 15.2% of the total market to about 18%. And in pure numbers, they're up 43%, i.e. 519 to 744. Meanwhile, the total number of students went from 344 to 4145. It increased by 21%, but you can see where the government schools actually only increased by 16% over that long period. This was just another little one looking at how the market share sat at each of those periods and what that actual growth has been. So, and I had it put to me yesterday that a lot of this independent growth has been in these lower fee independent schools, and I probably agree. And some of it's been in these Islamic schools because they are classed as independent, even though they may be an independent primary school. But the big picture is the numbers have been very much, and my pendulum, in my view, has been swinging very much in favour of the independent school, and that partly comes to there's a bit of hangover from what happened at the COVID. People pulled kids out or arranged them to go to independent school 4 or 5 years ago. That's still flowing through, but don't be surprised if the swing is coming back. And when we look at the actual ACARA numbers, these are the big picture numbers. I'm just wanting to just mention that 15% is the increase from 2020 to 2024. So 647 to 744, we're nearly 900, just under 100,000 more kids went to independent school over that 4-year period. So it's really been flowing, and the pendulum's been very much in that favour. When we look at that, I'm now wanting to take us into saying, well, what has happened in some of these independent schools? And when we do this, I'm starting to just take us into some co-ed versus independent versus single-sex schools. And the interesting thing is that Victoria went through this some years, probably in the 1990s, 2000, 2010. Sydney's is just happening now, and other places still haven't sort of got there at going co-ed as much as happened in Victoria. But you can see in Victoria in 2010, those were the numbers, and by 2024, it's now 88% of children at co-ed school. Now, the boys' schools didn't drop much, probably because they're basically full and staying. The girls' schools dropped a bit. Now, I'm just going to use the Melbourne example. There were 20 APS AGS schools in the last century when I went to school, all exclusive boys' schools. 12 of those have now gone co-ed, and you can see the schools, and you probably know the names of many of them. And some of these have gone to multiple campus, and at least 4 of them, Caulfield, Ivanhoe, Wesley, have gone multi-campus with 2 campuses, and Halebury about 4. The point of that is there's still 8 boys' schools, and they are pretty full. And when we look at their numbers, they're not changing much. And when I talk to them, they're not wanting to change much. That's sort of the model is we're happy, we've got what we want to be. When you look at what's been happening here, in 2020 with naught, 2024, 8 and 12, the boys since 2008 to 2024 have actually grown, the pure 8 boys schools, 7.1%. When we look at the co-eds, they have grown, that group of co-ed schools, 23.29%, but it's grown from 9,175 girls in '08 to 13,000 in 24, 46%. Boys had only grown about 8.4%. So the pressure that's really coming on is here, and especially it's being felt in those co-ed girls' schools. Now, many of them are able to hold their own. Good luck to how that's happening. But some of them are really suffering. And you can see if that is the amount that go back 20, 30 years, those girls were probably at these, the single-sex girls' schools and have come across, because their parents have chosen to these co-ed schools. So we can really see why there is some pressure on. And we took a group of schools, of girls' schools in Melbourne, probably 15 of them, added them all together, and it was over 8,000 students, and they had literally not grown at all in that period from '08 to 2024. Some were up, some were down, but nothing compared to what the co-ed thing happened. Now, why I'm just bringing that up is we're seeing that at Sydney now. We're starting to see a couple of schools going, big boys' schools going co-ed, Cranbrook and one other I'll get in a sec. And obviously the effect of that will start to be felt, but they're doing it slowly, but it will start to feel pressure on some of the full-blown single-sex girls' schools, in my view. So interesting to see if independent schools will keep growing. I'm indicating many are saying they are full, but does it really suit the government to let non-government schools take over more of the load? And the government announced this big better and fairer schools agreement and going to do a bit of investing, but I think we've all heard that before. Politically, does it suit especially Labor state governments who are now applying payroll taxes? I'm sure they happened in Melbourne where they moved the number up a bit so that it was really only hitting, I think it's now schools over 15,000 a year. So they probably worked out they weren't going to lose too many votes with that. But, this is political games being played. And if the economy is actually declining, and I have a bit of a view it is, but I'm not trying to be the economist. I also believe it's a bit unstable, basically caused by Trump and his actions at the moment. That will this cause a bit of a move back to lower fee government schools and even back to some more, lower fee schools, either independent or government in the next couple of years. So my view is that high socio-economic, low fertility, unaffordable for migrants and young people, the student numbers will decrease. Many schools will need to reach further out for students to maintain their status quo. And scenario planning, I'm a big believer, and I've often talked about for the strategic plan, you should have growth, maybe stay stable, maybe minor growth, maybe some small loss. And I think reality is a lot of schools that just keep saying, oh, we've been growing and isn't it been lovely, are going to feel the turn. And maybe from a budget point of view, they should be thinking that way. I work closely with John Somerset. I also have a very similar thinking. I'm ex-oil industry, and benchmarking and things like that were things we did for many, many, many years. And when John's work is done with benchmarking schools, he also made a comment that if you drop about 5%, you could be expected to see about $700,000 worth of change in your P&L. So small numbers in the enrolments make big numbers in the future generation in your funding. So I just want to say information can be used to make better business decisions. It's always been our motto. We work with data like the CEFA data, the ABS census data. The next one's happening on the 9th of August this year. I hope you all fill it in very honestly. Census data related to type of school attended, which is this, whether you go to government, independent or Catholic and what level you're at. We work very closely with population projections, and they only go at the moment from 22 to 32, and we've extrapolated them to 37, but we don't put any great warranty on that. It's just the only way we can get some feeling further on. And we use data like the My Schools, the ACARA, and the ASEQA data, which is for ELCs. What we do when we work with schools is we bring in data like where their students are, 2021, hopefully 2026 as they're moving forward. We don't actually want their name. We just want their ID number, the address, the feeder school. We don't want date of birth. We do similar with their future enrolments, your data, and we can work with alumni and bus lines and even which students are on which bus to help do bus navigation. So look, on that note, I'm going to stop my sharing and throw it back to Sue. And I know I'm probably running close to the time, but I'm happy to take any questions that may be there. I really apologise for what went wrong. That actually happened in our internet, but my phone, thank goodness, has held together and we seem to have been able to broadcast. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, thanks, Peter. Lots of really great information there. Nobody's actually put a question in the chat, but there was a couple of points I thought I might briefly discuss with you.
Sure.
Although you obviously don't want to pinch students from other areas, you've found some schools who've gathered students from unusual areas. So, for instance, Williamstown to Toorak. Can you just explain that one?
Well, that was an interesting one that caught me a little bit. It was Williamstown into that Toorak area in Melbourne. And as it turns out, the railway train goes straight from Williamstown, straight through Flinders Street Station or through Flinders Street, then goes out on the line out through Toorak and Paran and out that way. So instead of those schools having to put a bus on, they've got care of Vic Rail. They've got their own private train service. But they're unusual things that happen. But we do see schools, if they are right near a major train station, they obviously can really rely on that bringing students in, whereas other schools that aren't have to really rely on buses. And, we've dealt with schools that might have 10 or 15, buses and they run all over the place, but they normally don't have that much, public transport sitting there.
Yeah, I understood. And do you think also that a lot of schools are considering an alternative campus or an additional campus as another key way to?
Well, we are getting asked. We do projects for schools as a separate thing, which is, hey, we're thinking of opening a campus here. Tell me what you think about this area. And normally write the type of report that they either need to present to their school board, and then in a lot of cases, those reports may end up at funding applications with banks or with the various government sources that offer funding. And in fact, we ended up doing about 7 of them when the New South Wales government were doing that distribution of 65 million, the last tranche of that. So in those sort of reports, it comes down to what's happening, what's the forecast growth, how many kids go to independent school, what's the supply and demand going to look like, and therefore, what's logical to do it, combined with what is the ability of the area to pay fees. It's no good coming up with the lowest demographic area and saying we're going to build the greatest school if nobody's going to want to pay even a minimum amount. But we are pretty split up in Melbourne, and even lower socio-demographic areas in many cases have some people still quite wealthy and done very well and still want to send their kids to, quite reasonably paying schools. So it doesn't rule it out automatic. It's just the probability and numbers are going to be slightly less than, or are going to be less than obviously a higher socio-demographic. So the two things have to weigh up, but we get quite involved with doing those sort of applications for schools. We're very happy to do that.
Cool. Leon's asked, thanks, Peter. Have you had any success helping schools predict DMI? I'm not sure what that means, but unless you
I
do.
think DMI is the old. Okay, so the DMI is obviously the forget what we used to call it, SES score, I think it was called before then. And we were very good at doing SES scores. We actually had worked out the formula the government used, and it all tied in with the CFA and other things. So we were good at that. But the minute they went to this latest system, we don't have access. It's simply something that only the government can access because they access your tax records. And
Mm,
there's no way knowing they're planning to share that as public knowledge. So I
right.
must say, we can sort of do some calculation of what we may think it is based on the old CFA and the old way the SES was calculated and how that's relating then to those scores now. I really haven't chased it down too much. I guess it
Mm,
could be a project we could do where, but again, those scores you're talking about, the DMI, are unique to a school, so they're not actually unique to the area of where that school is. I could have a DMI for some kids coming to me in one suburb, and you might have a different DMI for the kids coming to your school from that same suburb because some are really rich and some aren't. And
mm.
I'm always nervous about that one because what I find is a lot of that's based on the census. And a funny story I tell people is I go down around the Mornington Peninsula a bit, and the lowest socio-economic area, or one of the medium socio-economics, is Portsea. Now, anyone knows Portsea is probably the equivalent of not quite Bellevue Hill, but for the rich and famous of Melbourne, Portsea is the go-to place. Then Sorrento, then Blairgowrie, then Rye. Now, all I can say is the people in Portsea must be in dreamland when they filled in their census because I know they're all retired and they don't earn much money, but they don't have to mention that, the billion-dollar
So
funds
it's,
that are all tied up down there. So
yeah,
some of these
absolutely.
things are a bit hard to work with.
Yeah. Now I know it's 1 o'clock. So the final question is, um, are you happy to help schools do a bit of a run through the numbers for their local area prior to engaging your services?
Well, I'm always happy to have a chat with the school and run
Hmm.
through some basics. If that's a half hour or 1 hour Zoom meeting, very, very happy to do that. We don't try and make a separate package. Our main jobs is a full analysis of the school and then backed up with our full mapping package. Now, our mapping package allows us to look at any area in terms of demographics, how many schools there are, all of the things I talked about. So I'm always happy to have a Zoom meeting and have a little chat about things and work out what you want to do from there.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Peter. It's been a really interesting webinar. Thank you, everybody, for turning up. Woody Allen says 80% of success is turning up. And so now up to you to take action. We'll make sure these slides and the recording come out to you later today. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Okay. Thank you very much. Take care.